Well, this Sunday in many church circles is known as Low Sunday. And it's known as Low Sunday because you're coming off the high point of Christmas. It's been a month full of singing and special services, and then you have a week full of family and more special services. And so the Sunday after Christmas, for many congregations, for many people, is known as Low Sunday. It's the Sunday that you're traveling, but you're not quite back home yet, or you got in late last night and getting up early on Sunday morning after traveling wasn't going to happen. It's the Sunday a lot of church choirs take off. They've been at full speed singing all through Advent. And most choir directors and choirs have off the Sunday after Christmas. It's usually the Sunday after Christmas where the head pastor who preached 3 or 4 Christmas Eve services and maybe a Christmas service or 2 is a little burnt out, so the associate pastor or the youth pastor gets the battlefield promotion for the week. The backup quarterback steps in to take a few snaps. It's the Sunday of Low Church. You knew I'm not going to get through any service that doesn't have some sports analogy in it. Just go ahead and succumb to that reality. But it's a Sunday where attendance is usually at its lowest. You've been going, and you just want to sleep in and rest on that Sunday. So, in the midst of this Low Sunday, it's a beautiful thing that it's a 5th Sunday this week, and we get to come together and do one service, and I get to preach one sermon and just hopefully put all the throws I can into this one bullpen session. So, to seize the moment of this Low Sunday, I thought I would take the good easy option and pick a nice controversial verse and just stir up some mud and have some fun up here in front of you all. So the reading this morning comes from the book of Galatians, which is actually one of Paul's more controversial epistles. In chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. I'll read it all in its entirety here. And then we're going to kind of just exegetically go through this and have a conversation about this good news to the people of Galatia here the Sunday after Christmas. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but as of today you are a child. And if you are a child, then you are also an heir through God. So this phrase opens up, when the fullness of time had come. God sent His Son. I love how the writer of Hebrews would later say this in the book. For God came at the culmination of the ages. There is this sense that what God did at Christmas, what God did in the birth of Jesus, was in many ways the end of one era and the beginning of a new one. Maybe that is why this reading fits so perfectly here on the last Sunday of the year, as we stand on the precipice of stepping into a new era. We are reminded that the fullness of the ages has come. The end of one thing has happened, but that also always means the beginning of a new thing is also happening in our midst. And it says God sent God's Son, born under the law, so that people might receive adoption. Now this is a loaded phrase, because where my ears jump to when I hear the phrase under the law, and where your ears jump to when you hear the phrase under the law, might or could be two different things. And I was talking with a pastor buddy of mine. How do you write sermons? How do you sit down and prepare to preach? And some of that comes down to, what do you think preaching is? Is preaching just a proclamation? You get up and just make a declarative sentence? Or is preaching this is what I think of it as it is. Is preaching this continual dialogue that really is back and forth, and there's a teaching aspect to it, and there's feedback, and there's give and take in this thing we call preaching. See, I say that because, have you ever had a conversation with somebody? I had a buddy in college, and it was always weird when new people would meet this friend. I can't say his name because he actually watches these. But when, this is going to be hard. When he would talk, and with somebody, he would just it was like he would just make a statement. It was a declarative sentence. That's what it was. And there was always this awkward pause after he would talk, because if it's just a statement, you don't know what to do with that sometimes. Because usually when you talk to somebody, there's a give and a take and an ebb and a flow, and there's kind of this verbal tennis that is going on back and forth, and you say a phrase that leads into them being able to say something, and it goes back and forth. But if you just make a statement, and you put the period at the end of your sentence, and it stops, and it's like, your turn, buddy. That doesn't flow real well. So I think of preaching as this back and forth, and in many ways it's informed by our conversations, our time in Bible study. So it's not just a time to get up here and proclaim, read this verse, tell you what it means, put a period at the end of the sentence, and call it good. It's hard to wrestle with the controversial books in our Bible and to preach about them without there being some dialogue, some teaching. So I say that this morning, I'm going to ask to you, when you read that phrase, under the law, what does that mean? What do you think of when you hear that? You don't have to answer. But I want you to think about that in your head of what would your answer be. I'm going to give you a few options as we play with this. I think in many ways we're all born into a law in our life. We all have laws and priorities and governing bodies over us. In many ways, we are all born under a law. Now, whether that is the law or a law, that's up for a discussion. And as you grow up and you get older, you become more and more aware of some of these laws that you live under. I'm always reminded around Christmas time. Because for many years, Christmas was a break from school. Christmas was a few weeks off and not going to school. You go to college, it's an entire month off of not going to school. It is Christmas, and the holidays are a few weeks of getting to sleep in, or getting to stay up, or not having a paper to write, or not having an endless to-do list. And it's great. then you walk into this awkward thing called being an adult. Christmas is no longer 2 to 3 weeks off. Christmas is Christmas Day off, right? But the weeks leading up to Christmas, the weeks after Christmas are, I gotta go to work. This is not the break that it used to always be. You become a little more aware of the laws that are at play in your life. Some laws you can say yes to, and some laws you can say no to, and some laws are not up for discussion. So in many ways, we're all born under a law. And we could go that direction with this passage. But in the sincerest form of teaching, I have to mention this. For many people, when you read this phrase in Galatians, or you come up on that word, the law, in the Bible, it typically is referencing Hebraic law. It's referencing the law of Moses. It's referencing the law of the Torah. And in many ways, that law of Moses, that law of the Torah, references the Jewish people. And this is where this gets difficult. This is where this is a controversial passage. This is where these are difficult things, because in this one passage in Galatians, we in one hand see the best of Paul. We see a Paul who summarizes the entire Christmas story in a sentence and a half, beautifully, profoundly, and what that means for us as newly adopted sons and daughters of God. But we also see a Paul that uses loaded phrases that people have discussed and tried to understand and have used as law, maybe in mistaken ways. Because in many ways, these statements that Paul makes about the law, and they were born to those under the law, and God came to redeem them from the law, it is all too easy to take this supersessionist view on what us as newborn Christian, as Gentiles in God's family, and say, oh, see, this culmination of the ages, this at the end of times, was God starting a new thing. And for generations of people later, would think of their Gentile, non-Jewish status as an adopted son or daughter of God, and believed that their adopted status meant they were the favorite sons and daughters of God, and that has led to very questionable, difficult relationships with Gentile Christians and God's original people, the Jewish Hebrew people. And so we can't wade into a passage of the Galatians and just skip over that and take a lightly interpreted view of the law. Because for somebody here, you might not have thought that the law was a connection to the law of Moses and the Jewish people, but for some of us here, you might have made that connection, and we want to go ahead and get all cards on the table with what God was doing here, what Paul is saying here. Because the scary end of this sword, and this is all too serious and all too real, mistaken, misused, misappropriated phrases to define the relationship between Gentile adoption and God's original children, the Jews, were phrases that were also used to fuel various genocides and even the Holocaust itself. Were built on the backs of phrases like this. So that's why this is a controversial verse, and it's hard to weigh into, and I have to make that statement about the law. Now you might be sitting there saying, whoa, this has gotten a little heavy to be dealing with here on Fifth Sunday. But there's a good thing in the midst of all this. There's a good thing coming that Paul is doing. Paul understands the tensions of these melding families of the time. That's actually what makes Galatians a controversial article, because I don't know if you know this. Jesus was actually a Jew. The 12 disciples following Jesus were also Jews. And for the longest time, this movement around the gospel of Jesus was a Jewish movement. Paul, the writer of these books, is a highly educated Pharisee who defines that he will be the apostle to the Gentiles. That's going to be his mission statement. He's going to travel across the Mediterranean and go to non-Jewish people and explain what this means for them in new and resounding ways. And then the brakes got hit real hard. Because there came all these questions around, well, what do we do with them? What do we do with, if we're going to take the good news across the Mediterranean to Gentiles, to non-Jewish people, how do they join the family? How's that going to work out? What are going to be their rights in this new relationship? What privileges do they get and or not get? Can they stay Gentiles? How do we do conversion? Can they come can they worship with us? Can they come into temple? These were a lot of circulating conversations because there were a lot of people that loved the movement, that loved the good news of Jesus, but they weren't Jewish people. And there was a lot of question marks of, so where did they stand in these concentric circles? How close can they get in to the inner sanctum? There was a phrase for these Gentile believers. They were called God-fearers. They feared God, they knew God, but they weren't fully converted. They weren't fully Jewish yet. And there were conversations around how do we do this? For you males in the room that are laughing at this, you get to giggle because you were actually a big part of the conversation. There was this little thing called circumcision that people didn't know. What are we going to do with that? It's great that you believe in God now, but there's a little procedure you need to go through to finalize the deal. These were conversations at the time of the letter to Galatians. And Paul comes out and talks about God's plan for adoption. And Paul talks about adoption not in inner circles and boundaries and who's in and who's out, Paul understands this adoption as being very broad. He came to the culmination of the ages, sent his Son so that we may no longer be slaves, that you may no longer be slaves. You get to now go from the outside to the inside, and you go from one end of the spectrum, and you get to skip all this stuff here in the middle and go right to being an adopted son or daughter of God. Paul wades into this argument of ins and outs and understood that God's adoption smashed all those boxes of who's in and who's out. He understood that God's adoption ended all those conversations of rights and privileges and who gets what in the inheritance of God. But to really understand this message, you have to somehow be able to suspend your current realities for a minute and believe and understand that there was a time in this tradition, in this faith, where us who are now insiders today were considered outsiders. We're considered people that could come to the door but not come in. That we, as Gentile believers of God and Gentile believers of the good news of Jesus Christ, we were almost there. But there were conversations on, could we come inside? Could we come to worship? Could we be baptized? Could we take communion? Could we be considered a member of the congregation? Were we to be granted religious rights and privileges that the insiders were? Could those of us on the outside hear an Apostle Paul speak and write a letter to our community and say, I want to take this good news and I want to preach it too, and I want to travel across the Mediterranean, and I want to help Paul in preaching this gospel to all people? Could we be allowed to do that? Could our Gentile, non-Jewish status allow us to speak authoritatively on God? Could we baptize others? Could we give communion? Could we lead or teach a congregation? And these were all conversations that were big question marks just because of where you were born, the religion you were raised in, where you were from, or in reality, really the race that was assigned and given to you. Could you partake and be a part in this message? And in comes Paul. He says God actually sent that Son so that you may be adopted. You're no longer a slave. You will now be adopted into full inclusion as a child of God. And he takes, that's good enough for me. I don't know about you, to be a son or a daughter with God. You could have stopped the sentence there. If you could sit there and say, I'm a brother or sister in Christ, you could stop the sentence there. That's good news enough. That's a game, set, match. That's it, bud. But Paul takes it another step. He says, if a child, then you are also an heir to the kingdom. An heir to God's plan and inheritance for this world. And naming an heir, having an heir, having a successor has always been a difficult thing in this world. See, I was raised, when I was growing up, the sport I chose, I was in gymnastics. And I participated in a gym that was a family-owned gym, like most gymnastics facilities are. And Let It Shine Gymnastics was the name of it. And Coach Tim was the owner. He had come out of college and decided he wanted to start a gym. And so him and a few buddies started this gymnastics gym, and it grew. And in many ways, it was the biggest gym in Middle Tennessee. But you could tell there, for some of us, that Tim had been running this show for 20 plus years, and Tim was ready to be done having to run the whole gym day in, day out. And the guys that he had started this gym with, Coach Kit and the wives that had been keeping this gym going, you could tell there was beginning to be questions of, Tim can't do this forever. Kit can't do this forever. But we also knew that without Kit or Tim, this gym was not going to keep going, that they were the only one that could do it. But there really was the belief that everybody knew that Tim was eventually going to give the gym to either his son Tanner or his daughter Tabby. But there were a lot of questions of, were they going to be ready? Could they be what Tim was? Was Tanner going to be ready to do it? They were 18, 19, 20, 22 years old like the rest of us, and in many ways were going to college and living life and maybe not knowing if they wanted to do the family business. Maybe they just didn't want to be Dad Jr. Maybe they didn't want to do what the family had always done, so they were going out and exploring other avenues before they realized maybe they had to come home and be the heir to the gym's life. So I go to college, I go away for a few years, I come back, I visit my home gym, and all of a sudden those questions were answered. Tanner had gone his way, he'd gone out, and it looked like Tanner had come back. Tanner was ready to take over family business. Tanner was ready to step into those shoes. And the same Tanner who I had coached with 5 years prior, who I never knew if Tanner was going to show up to class or not and teach with me. I had about a 50-50 chance if Tanner would actually be there, was now the guy in charge of the entire gym. I was there every day and teaching every class. And who are you and what did you do with Tanner Richards that I knew 4 or 5 years ago? You can be a child, but sometimes you actually make a choice to be an heir. If a child, also an heir to the kingdom. An heir to step into the family business. To continue the work of what God has done. To do the work of the Father when the Father has retired and settled into that comfy recliner. It's your job now. So if you are a child of God this morning, then in many ways you are also making the decision if you are going to be an heir and step into continuing the work of the family business. And like Tanner, that's not always an easy decision. Do you want to do Dad did. Do you want to go down that same path? And the hard question here is, what is the family business? We actually, in a room right now, are a room full of various family businesses. And for many people, sons have followed in the footsteps of the dad, and these family business, these cycles continue. And it's easy to know what the family business, when the family business is the car show, right? But the question is, in God's kingdom, what is the family business? And the answer is actually right here in Galatians. He said it a few sentences before. God sent His Son so that we may be freed. That we may no longer be slaves, but we may now be children. That's the work of God. That's the family business. If you're a child of God and you're an inheritor, you're the heir to that kingdom, you continue in the work of God, and the work of God is setting people free so that they also may be children of God. It is wading into the hard questions of boundaries, rights, and privileges, and saying, I believe God's adoption makes all of this null and void. Continuing the work of God are looking at the hard questions, realities, arguments, and disputes of our time and asking this question: who is enslaved in this situation? Who needs to be free? Who needs to be named a child of God? Who needs to be adopted? Who does not have rights and privileges right now that God wants to adopt them and give them the whole kingdom? If you're a child of God this morning, and you want to be an heir to the kingdom, those are the questions you ask to continue the family business going forward.